The Haphazard Haberdashery, a poem by George Vernon. It happened on a Friday afternoon, that happy hour between the dusk and the noon, when that buffoon named Henry went to shop for a splendid suit that would make his jaw drop from the top of his mouth to the cobbled street, so his chin would rest on top of his feet. When it came to fashion, Henry was a fool. Many had said he had no style at all. As a general rule, when wearing his clothes, the people would stare and turn up their nose at the garments he chose to be dressed within. They looked as though they'd been found in a bin. Let me begin by describing his shoes. Tattered and torn, they were well overdue for a brand new pair of leather-made laces. His trousers were ripped with patches in places. A pair of pink braces had stopped them from falling down round his ankles, which looked most appalling. His shirt was all brown, discoloured and stained, which even when washed the dirt still remained. His tie was plain grey, but the length was all wrong. He tripped on the end as it was far too long. So to stop him from falling flat on his face, he knotted the tie in a bow round his waist. His jacket was something you would not believe. It had just one button and only one sleeve. How naive he'd been to weave it at night. It was clear that he'd made it by candlelight. He wore a beautiful, bright blue top hat, but the dent in the side meant it never sat flat. But Henry knew that he looked like a tramp, so he went to give his fashion a vamp, at a place he'd always considered quite scary, the local shop called a haberdashery. Henry was wary as he entered the shop, and just stood in the doorway, as still as a mop.
"Good morning, sir. Can I help you at all?"
said the man at the counter, who was going bald. Henry called out, "Hello there, good man. I was wondering if you could lend me a hand. I need a suit for the coming weekend, a most splendid suit that will not offend."
"How utterly marvellous," said the assistant. "What's the occasion?"
being persistent. Then Henry just smiled and puffed out his chest, opened his mouth and replied with great zest, "Sunday will be the best day of my life, for that day I'm due to marry my wife."
"A wonderful wedding. Well, what a surprise. I'll just get my tape and then measure the size of your inside thigh and around your waist, in order to make you a suit of great taste."
So with haste the tailor went to his work, taking Henry's dimensions with an evil smirk. For you see, this tailor for ever had tried to steal the lady due to be Henry's bride. Her name was Heidi, and she was a peach, but for him this fruit was just out of reach, and though each time he tested her love, this tailor was shunned with a push and a shove. So with hatred and anger brewing inside, the tailor took revenge from what he'd been denied. He divided the cloth with the edge of his knife, and crafted the outfit with temper and strife. The fabric was frayed, the seams were not straight, the threads from his sewing were in a real state. He ripped the cravat so it looked like a rag, and stitched the breast pocket so it hung with a sag. The tails were cut long and dragged on the floor, and the wonky waistcoat you could not ignore. He tore through the satin and velvet and silk, and soiled the shirt with a pint of sour milk. Henry sat waiting with his back to this work, whilst the wicked man was going berserk with a smirk on his face for an hour or two, until the suit was completely askew, and although it was new, it looked such a mess, and showed no sign of style or finesse. He hung the clothes and placed them in a case, then closed the lid to conceal the disgrace. He laced a ribbon and tied it with a knot around the case so that Henry wouldn't spot the clutter of clothes that was hidden within, then tapped on his shoulder and smiled with a grin.
"Here is your suit. It's fit for a groom."
He handed to Henry the case filled with doom. "I assume it will fit?" asked Henry in doubt. "Because if it's wrong, I can't be without. And what about if I don't like the shape? I'll try it, in case you have made a mistake." In panic the tailor grabbed hold of his wrist and smiled through his eyes to conceal the red mist.
"Sir, I insist, for your fate will be struck. By wearing it early, you're destined bad luck."
He held the lid shut and said with great warning,
"Don't open this case until Sunday morning."
Henry was baffled, but saw not the hole that the tailor had dug for his gullible soul. So he doled out the money to pay the price, an expensive suit made from malice and vice. Then he took the advice and promised to wait, but the day of the wedding would be far too late. As Henry headed home with the case in his hand, he tried to reason what he couldn't understand. His worrying thoughts wouldn't budge from his mind, so he returned to his house and tried to unwind. But as he reclined himself back into bed, the most curious thought popped into his head. "My goodness, my hat!" cried Henry in shock. "I must go back, as that tailor forgot, to make me a hat that is fit for a groom, or else I'll be missing part of my costume." So with that on his mind, he resumed his sleep, and planned to return to that shop on that street. It happened on a Saturday morning, just as the sun had started its dawning, that Henry, still yawning, returned to that place where the tailor was sat with a frown on his face. He wasted no time in making his plea. "I need a top hat that will fit perfectly." The terrible tailor tightened his jaw, flexed his thin fingers, then said to assure,
"But of course, indeed, how silly of me! It's my own mistake, so I'll fix it for free."
So he snuck out through the shop's back door, to ruin the wedding and settle the score. As soon as Henry was out of his sight, the tailor made plans out of evil delight. With senses of spite, he acted so quick, and again played his part in a wicked trick. He placed an old brick inside a hat box, then fastened the lid with some rusty padlocks. With black in his heart, he harboured the key upon a high shelf so that no one would see. He gave it to Henry, the box full of dread. He held out the gift, then smiled cruelly and said, "It's shaped on your head, it's made to measure, crafted so well that you'll treasure forever." Accepting the box within his 2 palms, Henry felt the weight which pulled on his arms. He was quite alarmed at the bulk of the box, and questioned the need for the rusty padlocks. "It comes as a shock that it weighs such a ton, and why is it locked? Can the locks be undone?" The tailor placed his thumb against his chin, thought for a moment, then gave a thin grin.
"Within this box lies a hat of sheer splendour. However, its fabric is ever so tender, and though it's been rendered to utter perfection, it must be concealed to ensure its protection."
"But the weight?" asked Henry, scratching his head. "It feels like the hat box has been lined with lead." Instead of a panic, the tailor was calm. He widened his smile and turned on his charm.
"To save it from harm, it's encased in a mould moulded wholly from pure carat gold."
Henry's brown eyes bulged out of his sockets, but this false fortune would not fill his pockets. "How do I unlock it?" asked Henry with glee. He tugged at the padlocks without any keys.
"Well, sir, if you please, just do as I say, and you will be rich on your wedding day. The padlocks are set to unlock at dawn, as soon as the sun rises up in the morn. Then your hat can be worn, along with your suit, and the gold will be yours to keep as your loot."
Henry had been in pursuit of a house in which to move into with Heidi his spouse. "Why, thank you," said Henry with tears in his eyes. "You've made me the happiest man that's alive, for now we can strive in building our home. How can I repay the kindness you've shown?" The tailor just sniggered with a moaning squeak. "It's nothing," he said, with his tongue in his cheek. With the heavy box full of empty hope, Henry headed home down the dark cobbled slope. "Now we can cope with what lies ahead. Our wealth is secure, and now we can wed." and so to his bed, where he peacefully lay, blind to the horrors of his wedding day. It happened on that sad Sunday morrow that Henry woke up feeling ever so hollow, for below his bed on the floor lay the box, still fastened securely with rusty padlocks. The clock had struck 10, which meant he was late. He found a hacksaw, no longer could he wait. He severed the steel with the blade of the saw, and cut till the padlocks fell down to the floor. With terror he tore off the top so quick, revealing no gold, but only the brick. Henry felt sick with the shock of it all. He knew he'd been duped, and felt ever so small. "Try not to panic," he said to himself. "The gold would have only brought trouble with wealth. At least I've my health, and my bride-to-be, and a suit which should fit me most perfectly." He picked up the case containing his ware, opened the lid, and looked in with despair, for there in the case lay the muddle of clothes, like the withered petals from a wilting rose. Henry was frozen. He said not a word. He could not believe what had just occurred. As tears blurred his eyes, he said with great loathing, "That tailor has trashed each piece of my clothing." No sooner had he discovered this crime, when heartbroken Henry heard wedding bells chime. For now it was time to go to the church, to face friends and family, who, no doubt, would smirch, and search for a reason behind his attire, and mock him for wearing an outfit so dire. With nothing to wear apart from this mess, Henry reluctantly got himself dressed. He felt so distressed as he ran through the town, dragging his clothing, he looked like a clown. He flew down the graveyard, through the church door, where people sat waiting, 100 or more. He tried to smile as he walked down the aisle, but the frowns people made were ever so vile. It felt like a trial, with them as his jury, judging his life based on dress sense with fury. Henry was sure he'd dishonoured his name, and stood at the altar, his head hung with shame. With low flowing notes the organ began. The vicar invited those present to stand. Then Henry's best man nudged at Henry's side, and whispered excitedly, "Here comes the bride." How can I describe the sight Henry saw, as Heidi walked in through the wooden church door? The dress Heidi wore was odd for a bride. The train had been made with a tear down one side. The veil had been tied with some rope at the edge. She looked as though she'd been dragged through a hedge. The threads of her stockings were in a real state. Her garter was ripped, and the seams were not straight. The corset was laced with some string which was frayed. Her bouquet of flowers had started to fade. The jewellery was dull, which made her look poor. The twisted tiara you could not ignore. Her gloves had been torn, the silk was not real, and one of her shoes had snapped off at the heel. Henry was stunned at the sight of his bride. Though Heidi wore rags, she was beaming with pride. She stood at his side, took hold of his hand, and Henry then whispered, "I don't understand." And Heidi then answered, as bells rang above, "The suit doesn't matter, it's you that I love." So Henry and Heidi made husband and wife. Together they were for the rest of their life, and shared all their love, their care and compassion, and never attempted to follow a fashion. With passionate joy they shared in much laughter, and so they both lived happily ever after. The end.